You already know her. Close your eyes and she's right there. An old woman at the edge of the village, past the last house, where the fields give way to the trees. She knows things nobody taught her. Which leaves stop a fever, which root brings on a birth, which words to whisper over a sick child. The women come to her in the dark, quietly, when the doctor is too far away or too expensive or simply doesn't exist. And one day the men come for her too, with torches, with a rope, with a Bible. And they burn her for the crime of knowing too much. It's a powerful story. It's on tote bags now. We are the granddaughters of the witches you couldn't burn. It's the idea that the witch hunts were really a war on women's knowledge, that Europe took its healers, its midwives, its wise women, and set them on fire to hand medicine over to men. Here's the uncomfortable part. Almost none of that is true. Not exaggerated, not embellished, structurally, factually wrong. And the people who first sold it to you knew they were guessing. So let's talk about the folk healer, the real one. Because the real story is stranger, and I'd argue it's more interesting than the poster. Let me make the case for the myth first, because it deserves a fair hearing. It didn't come from nowhere, and if you believe it, you're in extremely good company. The version most of us absorbed goes like this. For most of history, ordinary people had no medicine worth the name. What they had was the local wise woman, the herb wife, the cunning woman, the midwife. She was the community's doctor, pharmacist, and counselor rolled into one, and her knowledge was passed hand to hand, mother to daughter, outside of books and universities and the church. She was, in a real sense, the last keeper of a folk tradition older than kings. And then, the story goes, she became a threat. As male physicians organized, as the church tightened its grip, this independent woman with her own power and her own income became something to be destroyed. The witch hunts were the weapon. Millions of women, you've heard the number, 9 million, were tortured and burned. And the ones targeted first were the healers and the midwives. Kill the wise woman and you kill the competition. Medicine becomes a man's profession. Birth becomes a doctor's business. And 1,000 years of women's knowledge goes up in smoke. You can see why it lands. It explains why medicine got so male so fast. It gives a name and a face to real misogyny, which absolutely existed. It turns scattered cruelty into a story with a motive. And crucially, that feels like the kind of thing that would have happened. Powerful men crushing a powerful woman to take what she had. We know that shape. We recognize it in our bones. And there's one more reason it sticks, which is that there's a grain of something true buried in it. The church really was nervous about women's power over birth and the body. The infamous witch hunting manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, printed in 1486, really does single out midwives in lurid, paranoid terms, accusing them of stealing and sacrificing infants. So it's not that the fear didn't exist on paper. It absolutely did. The question, and this is the whole game, is whether that paper fear turned into an actual systematic slaughter of healers on the ground. Because a demonologist writing a scary book and a village actually dragging its midwife to the gallows are two very different things. One is a fantasy, the other leaves records, and the records are what we're going to look at. So this isn't a stupid belief. It's a belief built out of real ingredients, real misogyny, a real scary manual, a real shift toward male doctors, assembled into a picture that turns out not to match the evidence, which is the most interesting kind of wrong there is. Not a lie, a misfire. Let me show you where it misfires. Here's the crack. The first thread you pull, and the whole sweater starts to move. The 9 million figure, the one on the memorials, the one people quote to prove the scale of it, is not a historical count. It's a math error from the 1780s. A German lawyer named Gottfried Christian Voigt took the number of witch trials in one town over one stretch of time and multiplied it out across all of Europe across 4 centuries, as if witch trials happened everywhere at the same rate. They didn't. Whole regions barely had any. He got roughly 9 million. And that number, invented by extrapolation, got picked up in the 19th and 20th centuries because it was rhetorically enormous. Bigger, people like to point out, than the death toll it was later compared to. So what's the real number? Historians spent the 1970s and 80s doing the boring, brutal work, actually counting surviving trial records, region by region. The scholarly consensus now lands at somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 people executed across the entire main era of witch hunting, roughly the 15th to the 18th century. Every death a real horror, but 30 to 60,000 is not 9 million. It's off by a factor of about 200. And here's the second crack, the one that really doesn't fit. Not all of those executed were women. Overall, yes, women were the clear majority. Most estimates put it around 75 to 80% across Europe. But most hides a wild variation. In Normandy and northern France, the majority of accused witches were men. In Russia, most were men. In Estonia, most were men. And in Iceland, this is the one that breaks people's brains, around 90% of those accused of witchcraft were men. If the witch hunt was a machine specifically built to destroy women healers, someone forgot to tell Iceland. And while we're breaking things, the timing is wrong too. The myth files the witch hunts under the Dark Ages, some medieval superstition we grew out of. Nope. The peak of the killing was roughly 1560 to 1630. That's not the medieval past. That's the age of Descartes, of Galileo, of Shakespeare writing his plays. The witch craze wasn't the dying gasp of a superstitious Middle Ages. It happened during the birth of modern science, run by educated men in the middle of what they thought of as an enlightened century, which should bother you a lot more than the fairy tale version does. One more, because they keep coming. The witches weren't burned, at least not where the story usually pictures it. In England and its American colonies, witchcraft was a hanging offense. Margaret Jones, Salem, the lot, hanged, not burned. Burning at the stake happened in parts of continental Europe and in Scotland, though even in Scotland the condemned were usually strangled first and their bodies burned after. The burning times, the phrase you'll see everywhere, is, for a huge chunk of the English-speaking world, the myth is built on. Just wrong about the method. So let's recap the damage because we've knocked over a lot in a hurry. The number is off by roughly 200 times. The victims weren't all women. In some countries, they were mostly men. The timing isn't medieval. It's early modern and scientific. And the burning isn't even universal. 4 load-bearing beams of the myth, and we haven't even reached the main claim yet. So now the real question, who actually got accused? And crucially, was she the healer? Let me introduce you to 2 women. They're going to sit at opposite ends of this whole story, and the gap between them is the point. The first is a composite, but she's built entirely out of the real record. Call her Agnes. Agnes is the village midwife somewhere in England, around the year 1600. And here's the thing the myth gets exactly backwards. Agnes is not a hunted outsider. Agnes is licensed. In much of Europe, to practice midwifery legally, she had to be examined and approved. And in England, that license came from the church, from the bishop's court. She was vouched for by the women she delivered and by her parish priest. She was, in the eyes of her community, a pillar of it. Respectable, trusted, established. And when she took her oath to get that license, she swore, I'm quoting the actual 16th century wording from Bishop Bonner's form, that she would not use or exercise any witchcraft, charms, sorcery, invocations, or prayers other than those allowed by the church. Sit with that. The midwife wasn't the witch the authorities feared. The midwife was the one they licensed to guard against witchcraft. She was on the establishment side of the line by design. When a baby was dying and needed emergency baptism, the church trusted the midwife to do it. You do not hand that job to the woman you're planning to burn. Now the second woman, her name is real, Margaret Jones, of Charlestown in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. She was a healer. She used herbs, anise seed, simple remedies, things that by her own account were harmless. And in 1648, she became the first person executed for witchcraft in Massachusetts. So, case closed? The healer burns after all? Read the actual record and it curdles. What sealed Margaret's fate, according to Governor John Winthrop's own journal, was this. Her harmless medicines were said to have extraordinary violent effects, and she had a habit of telling patients that if they refused her treatment, they'd never get better. And then, unnervingly, they didn't. There was even a grubby detail about the accusation starting after some angry words with her neighbors, followed by their cattle taking sick. In other words, she wasn't accused because her healing failed. She was accused because it looked too effective, too knowing, and because she'd quarreled with the wrong people. Margaret wasn't hunted as part of a program to wipe out midwives. She was one woman, undone by suspicion and a grudge, in a colony primed to see the devil in a confident woman. Now zoom out from Margaret to the whole population of the accused, because the profile is the tell. Pull the trial records together, and the typical accused witch is not a skilled professional with rare knowledge. She's poor. She's old, frequently past 60, often a widow, a woman with no husband and no son to speak for her. She's the one who begs at doors and curses under her breath when she's turned away, and then when the household's baby sickens the next week, everyone remembers the curse. In the Würzburg trials in Germany, one study found the overwhelming majority of accused women were over 40. This is not the demographic of a valued village doctor. This is the demographic of the person a frightened, unlucky community finds easiest to blame. And here's the detail that truly detonates the myth, so let me say it plainly. In several parts of Europe, the folk healers weren't the victims of the hunt, they were among the accusers. Think about the logic of the cunning trade for a second. If your whole business is unbewitching people, breaking curses, naming the guilty witch, then your professional job, the thing clients pay you for, is to point at someone and say, her. She did it. The counter-witch was, in practice, one of the engines that fed suspects into the machine. So the story where the wise woman is the pure victim and the establishment is the pure villain collapses from the inside. Some of the wise women were helping to light the fires. Let's get you out of the 21st century for a minute. Forget everything you know about medicine. You're standing in a village in, let's say, 1590. Your child has a fever that won't break. 3 days now. Their skin is hot and dry, and they've stopped asking for water. There is no hospital, there is no doctor you could afford, and the nearest university-trained physician is a 2-day ride away and would charge more than you make in a season, and honestly, he'd probably just balance your child's humors by taking blood you can't spare. So what do you actually do? You go to the cunning man, or the wise woman, the person 3 houses over who everyone quietly agrees knows things, and notice you're not sneaking. You're not scared of them. You bring a coin or a chicken or a promise, and you knock on the door in daylight because half the village has done exactly this. They give you a poultice of herbs and maybe a written charm to pin to the child's shirt, words in Latin you can't read, and they tell you to keep the child warm and come back in 2 days. And here's what I want you to feel. Relief. Not fear. Relief. Because this person is the closest thing your world has to hope. If you suspect someone has cursed your child, who do you go to? Not a priest, necessarily. You go to the cunning folk. Because their main job, the thing they were famous for, was undoing witchcraft. They were the counter witches, the people you hired to break a spell, name the person who cast it, find your stolen goods, tell your fortune, mend your luck. In your world, the folk healer isn't the witch. The folk healer is your defense against the witch. That is the exact opposite of the poster. Now hold that same scene and change one thing. The herbs work. The fever breaks on the 3rd day, the way the wise woman said it might, and your child sits up and asks for bread. You are flooded with gratitude. but somewhere at the back of your mind, in a world where everyone believes that power over the body is real, a colder thought moves. How did she know? What else can that knowing do? The very thing that makes her valuable, that she can reach into a sick body and change what happens, is the same thing that, on a bad day in a bad year, with the wrong grudge in the air, could get her named. That's the trap the real folk healer lived inside, not a manhunt organized from above. A slow, ambient suspicion that was the flip side of being useful. You loved her when your child lived. You'd have to work very hard not to look at her sideways when your neighbor's child died. Standing in that doorway, you would have found the tidy modern story, evil men, innocent healer, completely baffling. The danger in your world doesn't come down from the king. It comes sideways, from the people next door. Okay, I've been making big claims. Let me put the receipts on the table because on this channel, that's the whole deal. Claim 1. The midwives weren't systematically hunted. Our best source here is the historian David Harley, who in 1990 published a paper with a title I love. Historians as Demonologists, the myth of the Midwife-Witch. He went straight to the trial records, and what he found was that in the vast number of witch trials, midwives were very rarely the accused. In Scotland, which had one of the highest execution rates in Protestant Europe, you can identify maybe 14 midwives among the accused, and as Harley points out, that's around 1% or less of the total. His verdict on the historians who'd claimed otherwise is blunt. He wrote that they had behaved like demonologists, repeating old stories without checking their sources. That's a historian accusing his own colleagues of doing exactly what the witch hunters did, believing a scary story because it was satisfying, not because it was true. Claim 2. The folk healers, the cunning folk, largely weren't persecuted as witches at all. The authority here is Owen Davies, probably Britain's leading academic on the history of magic. His work shows that cunning folk operated openly for centuries, that both church and state often turned a blind eye, and that only a very small percentage of them were ever charged, because ordinary people drew a hard line between the helpful magic they paid for and the harmful witchcraft they feared. There were thousands of these practitioners working in England alone. They advertised, they had regulars. This is not the footprint of a hunted underground. Claim 3, and this is the one I can't resist, because it's where the myth accidentally tells a truth. Was the folk knowledge real? Was any of it actual medicine? Sometimes even, yes, strikingly. In 2015, researchers at the University of Nottingham took a recipe from a 10th century Anglo-Saxon medical text called Bald's Leech Book, an eye salve, garlic, onion, wine, and ox gall, a bile from a cow's stomach, brewed in a brass vessel and left to sit for 9 days. They mixed it up by the medieval instructions and tested it on MRSA, the modern antibiotic-resistant superbug that terrifies hospitals. It killed up to 90% of the bacteria, a 1,000-year-old folk remedy performing in the lab, as well as a last-line modern antibiotic. And it's not a fluke. Willow bark, a classic folk painkiller, contains salicin, which is the direct chemical ancestor of aspirin. So the wise woman's basket wasn't superstition, some of it was pharmacology we hadn't caught up to yet. Hold both of those facts at once, because together they're the whole show. The folk healers often did have real, valuable knowledge, and they were mostly not the ones being burned. The myth fused a true thing and a false thing into one sentence, and the sentence went viral for 200 years. So where did the 9 million burned healers story even come from, if not from history? This is the part that reframes everything, so stay with me. The modern version was crystallized in 1973 in a short, fierce pamphlet by 2 American writers, Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English, called Witches, Midwives, and Nurses. Their argument was that the persecuted witches had essentially been the people's doctors. Women, healers deliberately wiped out by a rising male medical establishment. It was passionate, it was political, and it was written to fuel a very real and very justified fight. the women's health movement of the 1970s, women demanding authority over their own bodies and their own profession. As a rallying cry, it was electric. As history, later scholars found it didn't hold. It leaned on discredited earlier work, and it ran straight past an awkward fact that the majority of those persecuted were neither healers nor midwives, and that in some places the local healers were among the people pushing the accusations, not just receiving them. Now, did women get pushed out of medicine as it professionalized? Yes. That part is real, and I don't want to wave it away. As universities, licensing bodies, and eventually male-dominated obstetrics rose over the 17th and 18th centuries, women who had delivered babies and dosed fevers for generations were gradually shut out of the formal profession. That's a genuine injustice with a genuine gender to it. But look at the mechanism. It happened mostly through paperwork, through licenses and guilds and who was allowed to call themselves a physician, not through a bonfire. The witch hunt and the sidelining of women healers are two different stories that happen to overlap in time, and the myth's core error is welding them into one. It borrowed the horror of the trials to dramatize the slow, bureaucratic squeeze of professionalization. Understandable, powerful, not what the records say. And here's the twist that I think actually matters. The historian Diane Purkis, no friend of the patriarchy, criticized the myth not because it's pro-woman, but because it isn't. She called it not politically helpful, because it takes the accused woman and, once again, reduces her to a helpless victim of powerful men, a body acted upon, a symbol in someone else's argument. The real records show something with more dignity in it. Women who were neighbors and property owners, and businesswomen and defendants who argued back, embedded in messy local feuds about land and reputation and grudges, not a faceless mass of martyred herbalists. The myth, for all its feminist intentions, flattened them exactly the way the witch hunters did, which lands us somewhere uncomfortable and, I think, important. We tell the folk healer story because it's clean. Good knowledge, evil power, a clear villain, and we should be suspicious of ourselves precisely when a historical story is that clean, because that's the exact texture of a story, built to win an argument rather than to describe what happened. The 9 million myth and the witch hunters actually share a method. Both preferred a satisfying story to a checked source, and you still see that method everywhere. Every time a tidy, emotionally perfect historical claim rockets around the internet with a number attached, ask the boring question: where's that number from? Who counted? The most radical thing you can do with the past is refuse to let it be simpler than it was. I don't want to leave you with just a debunk, because the real people deserve better than that. So here's where I've landed. The folk healer was real. She, and often he, was the cunning woman, the herb wife, the licensed midwife, the counter witch you ran to in the dark with a sick child. Some of what they knew was genuine, tested, hard-won medicine that we've only recently confirmed with a lab. They were valued. They were paid. They were mostly not burned. And the woman who was burned, Margaret Jones, and the tens of thousands like her, usually wasn't killed for her knowledge. She was killed by fear, and by neighbors, and by a grudge given a supernatural name. Both of those are worth remembering, and they're two different truths. Flattening them into one poster does a disservice to all of them. The healers who weren't martyrs, and the victims who weren't healers. History is under no obligation to give us a clean villain. And the past gets more interesting, not less, the second you let it be complicated. So here's the question I'll leave you with, and I genuinely want to read the comments on this one. If the story we told about the witch hunts turned out to say more about the 1970s than about the 1590s, what stories are we telling right now with total confidence that a historian in 100 years is going to gently take apart? Because we've all got a 9 million in us somewhere. I'll see you in the next one.